Chapter 11 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Jenner. Princess Mary's Gift Book, Chapter 11, True Spartan Hearts, by Beatrice Harraden. In times of war, the Spartan women used to say to their husbands and sons, "Return with your shield or on it," meaning that they must either conquer or die. There was no affection or indulgence shown towards the warriors who survived a defeat, for loyalty to the state was thought of more account than personal loss, and he who had not died striking his last blow for Sparta was deemed unworthy of remembrance, and could expect no mercy from those who had loved him and sent him to the battlefield to conquer or die. So this was how the Spartans felt about their warriors, and you can imagine their indignation as well as their dismay when, in the year 371 BC, news reached Sparta that their army had been defeated at the Battle of Leuctra by the Boeotians, a rival Grecian state, and that 300 men had saved their lives in flight. The news was brought at the moment when some great festival was being celebrated in the city. The ephors commanded the names of the slain to be made known to their relatives, and the women were forbidden to mourn. But the mother of Eucrates could not at first hide her grief, and her neighbours said amongst themselves, "Why should she be sorrowful? Her son has died bravely. If he had disgraced himself by flight, then only would she have the right to mourn." The old man Phidon came in to see her, and found her spinning, busily engaged at her work, it is true, but with tears in her saddened eyes. He was a very stern old man, a Spartan every inch of him, and he spoke harshly to poor Ione. "Ione," he said, "not one single tear should course down your cheeks. Not one single pang of grief should assail your heart. I it is who should weep. I it is who should mourn, for Callias, my grandson, is not amongst the slain. Unlike your brave Eucrates, my Callias has not died at his post of duty. He lives, and by living he has brought dishonour and shame on his family. How can I meet him? What can I say to him? Nay, I will not look upon his face. I will not vouchsafe one word of greeting to him. His father was the glory of my life, but he is the soul of its shame. The gods have been cruel to me in my old age, but they have been merciful to you, Ione. For your son, death with honour. For my Callias, life with dishonour. His father won the crown of wild olive in the Olympic Games, and earned the right of fighting by the king's side, and died there, and I was proud of him. But woe is me that I cannot be proud of Callias." And Spartan mother as she truly was, Ione knew well that here was a grief far greater than her own loss of her beloved son. She brushed her last tear aside and tried to comfort old Phidon, whom she had known all of her life. Her son Eucrates and this very Callias had been friends together ever since they were children, and in the days gone by, Phidon and Ione's father had fought side by side for Sparta. "Maybe, Phidon," she said, "the gods have spared Callias and his comrades so that they may yet serve Sparta and help her to triumph over her enemies." But he shook his head and would hear no word of comfort, though as the days went by it seemed to ease his stern spirit to sit beside her and watch her at her work. And then she would speak to him of Callias and urge him not to be over hard on the lad when he returned. "You must pardon him, Phidon," she said. "Perchance he will live to do great things for Sparta." But the old man said proudly, "Nay, Ione, never a word will I speak to Callias again." And it was in vain that Ione pleaded for the friend of Eucrates, always imploring the old man to believe that the gods in their wisdom had preserved Callias for some splendid act of service and sacrifice yet to come. Full of these thoughts, and haunted by Phidon's unyielding severity, she had a strange dream one night. She dreamed that King Agesilaus was willing to pardon all those 300 soldiers who had fled from the field of Leuctra, but that Phidon interposed, and standing in the public assembly, gave his vote against the pardon. "My own grandson is one of the survivors," he cried. "Sparta may pardon him, but I never will." The next day she told her dream to Phidon, and described to him how with her mind's eye she had seen Callias standing lonely and forsaken, the only one of the 300 survivors who had been spurned and unforgiven. His loneliness stabbed her to her heart, more even than the loss of her son, and because there was no one else, she had been impelled to stand by his side, to greet him, to encourage him, to reassure him. And just as he lifted his head, bowed in grief and shame, she awoke. When Phidon heard her dream story, his stern heart was softened. "I will not turn from Callias," he said. "It may be that you are right, Ione. It may be that the gods will yet give him some great and glorious chance. I will steel my heart to receive him." So Ione triumphed at last, and truly her dream would seem to have been some kind of divination, for 2 or 3 days afterwards a decree was proposed by the king and passed in the assembly to the effect that all those who had fled from the field of Leuctra were to be pardoned and received home without dishonour. Ordinarily, all survivors of a defeat were subject to penalties of civil offence, and so this was quite an unusual proceeding. But no doubt it was thought dangerous to take stern measures against such a large number of Spartan citizens. Well, whatever the reason was, there were many glad hearts in Sparta that day, and old Phidon himself owned in secret to Ione that he longed to see Callias once more. "For I must needs forgive him wholeheartedly," he said, "since Sparta has forgiven him. But with my last breath I would tell you and all the world that I would far, far rather he had fallen by the side of brave Eucrates. That would have been my glory." As soon as news had come of the defeat of the Spartan army, the whole remaining military force of Sparta was sent to the rescue, and after some time returned to Sparta, bringing back the survivors from the disastrous field of Leuctra. Then Spartan hearts were softened, and mothers, wives and sisters stood waiting to greet those whom the gods had spared for future service. But Ione sat at home spinning. There were no tears in her eyes now, and her countenance was lit up by a calm pride. She had learnt to be glad that she had no one to meet that day. Suddenly the door opened, and Phidon came in. His manner was strangely excited. "Callias is not amongst us," he cried. "I've asked for him, and no one knows. Could there have been some mistake, I wonder? Is it possible that—" At that moment there came a loud knock at the door, and Ione opened it to Timotheus, a neighbour's son. "Greetings to the mother of Eucrates," he said as he stood before Ione. "I am from Leuctra. I saw Eucrates fighting in the thickest of the fray. I saw him fall, and there fell another by his side, fighting as gallantly as he, his comrade in death as well as in life." "And who was it that died with my brave son?" asked Ione, whose hands were pressed together deep into her breast, and whose face was ashen, though tearless. "It was Callias," answered the young man. "Farewell, honoured mother of Eucrates. I must go and seek Phidon to tell him." But Phidon rose to his full height, and there was a smile of triumph on his face and a new life in his bearing. "Phidon has heard the news," he said, "and he thanks the gods for this crowning mercy. For though in his inmost heart he would have fain seen the face of his grandson once more, there was something dearer to him than the face of Callias. It was the honour of Callias." Then, turning to Ione, he said, "Now we can think of them together, and share our pride in them, Ione." For one fleeting moment Ione saw a vision of her young, fair son falling before the foe, but her voice never faltered as she said, "Yes, we can share our pride in them." That was the true Spartan tribute to the heroes of Leuctra. You see, the Spartans would not admit of despair in their lives. They believed that while there was yet strength in the body, there must needs be hope in the heart that the victory would be won. And so it was the duty of a true Spartan to fight and conquer and live or to die, striving to conquer to the very last, with no thought of any possibility of failure. What do you think about this grand old Spartan code of honour? Do you not think that we ourselves, each in our own way, young and old, man and woman, boy and girl, may find something helpful in it to bring to the service of our country? End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Princess Mary's Gift Book. Chapter 12. Big Steamers by Rudyard Kipling. Oh, where are you going to, all you big steamers, with England's own coal up and down the salt seas? We are going to fetch you your bread and your butter, your beef, pork, and mutton, eggs, apples, and cheese. And where will you fetch it from, all you big steamers, and where shall I write you when you are away? We fetch it from Melbourne, Quebec, and Vancouver. Address us at Hobart, Hong Kong, and Bombay. But if anything happened to all you big steamers, and suppose you were wrecked up and down the salt sea, why, you'd have no coffee or bacon for breakfast, and you'd have no muffins or toast for your tea. Then I'll pray for fine weather for all you big steamers, for little blue billows and breezes so soft. Oh, billows and breezes don't bother big steamers, for we're iron below and steel rigging aloft. Then I'll build a new lighthouse for all you big steamers, with plenty wise pilots to pilot you through. Oh, the channel's as bright as a ballroom already, and pilots are thicker than pilchards at loo. Then what can I do for you, all you big steamers? Oh, what can I do for your comfort and good? Send out your big warships to watch your big waters, that no one may stop us from bringing you food. For the bread that you eat and the biscuits you nibble, the sweets that you suck and the joints that you carve, they are brought to you daily by all us big steamers, and if anyone hinders our coming, you'll starve. End of chapter 12, read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kra.org, on Tuesday, August 27th, 2013, in San Diego, California.
Chapter 13 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Princess Mary's Gift Book. Chapter 13. A True Story from Camp. By the Bishop of London. You boys and girls must picture a huge common and 4 groups of khaki-clad soldiers standing at attention in different parts of it. They are about to be reviewed by the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Forces. The men had given up a great deal to come and join the Territorial Forces, but it had not yet thoroughly dawned on them, any more than on the rest of England, how great was the crisis, and none of the battalions had come out in sufficient strength to be sent out on foreign service. The inspection by the great General took a long time, and when the order came for rank after rank to lie down, they did so with obvious relief. At last the inspection was over, and all the battalions were asked to converge on one point. At this point a wagon was placed, and all the 5,000 men lay down round it, the generals and their staffs lying behind it. It was a fine sight from the wagon to see those 5,000 fine fellows lying there in the light of the setting sun. But was it possible to rouse them to see the country's urgent need? I began by painting the beauty and the glory of England, the loveliest place in the world, for you may go all over the world, children, and you will never find anything so glorious or welcome on your return as the white cliffs of Dover and the railway run through the hop gardens of Kent. And what touched them most was the thought of what England stood for in the life of the world. It always has been, and always will be, the home of freedom. Let a slave once reach a British man of war, he is free. Britannia's daughters are rallying to her now because she has given them freedom, for they see that she is the champion in this war of the freedom of the world against a universal tyranny. Then I turn to what they themselves owed to England, their homes, their faith, their security to work, their happy friendships, and their love of wife, mother, and children. What they had not realized up to now was that all this was in deadly peril for the first time for 100 years. One mistake of our fleets, one crushing defeat in France, and the foe would be upon us. The fate of Belgium would be the fate of England. What more glorious than to follow the example than those who had fought and died for England? Nor needs he any hearse to bear him hence, who goes to join the men of Agincourt." In spite of the presence of the generals, a great cheer broke from the 5,000 men when I said, "I would rather die than see England a German province." But finding that they were allowed to cheer, as deep a cheer followed the statement that, if it came to the last Waterloo, it was far better to slip across the silver streak and fight it on the other side than let an invader's foot, for the first time for 1,000 years, stain our native land. In the evening all the 4 battalions present volunteered for foreign service, and as 4 more at the neighbouring camp had volunteered the day before in answer to a similar appeal, 8 battalions were added to the fighting strength abroad of the British Army. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pam Castile. Princess Mary's Gift Book, Chapter 14, The Ebony Box, by A. E. W. Mason. "No, no," said Colonel von Altrock abruptly. "It is not always true." The conversation died away at once, and every one about that dinner table in the Rue St. Florentin looked at him expectantly. He played nervously with the stem of his wine-glass for a few moments, as though the complete silence distressed him. Then he resumed with more diffident air. "War no doubt inspires noble actions and brings out great qualities in men, from whom you expected nothing. But there is another side to it which becomes apparent, not at once, but after a few months of campaigning. Your nerves get overstrained, fatigue and danger tell their tale. You lose your manners, sometimes you degenerate into a brute. I happen to know. 30 years have passed since the siege of Paris, yet even today there is no part of my life which I regret so much as the hours between 11 and 12 o'clock of Christmas night in the year '70. I will tell you about it if you like, although the story may make us late for the opera." "It will not matter if we are a little late," said his hostess, the Baroness Hammerstein, and her guest agreed with her. "It is permitted to smoke?" asked the Colonel. For a moment the flame of a match lit up and exaggerated the hollows and the lines upon his lean, rugged face. Then, drawing in his chair to the table, he told his story. "I was a lieutenant of the 5th Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 103rd Regiment, which belonged to the 23rd Infantry Division. It is as well to be exact. That division was part of the 12th Army Corps under the Crown Prince of Saxony, and in the month of December formed the southeastern segment of our circle about Paris. On Christmas night I happened to be on duty at a forepost in advance of Noisy-le-Grand. The centigrade thermometer was down to 12 degrees below zero, and our little wooden hut with the sloping roof, which served us at once as kitchen, messroom, and dormitory, seemed to us all a comfortable shelter. Outside its door the country glimmered away into darkness, a great white silent plain of snow. Inside, the camp bedsteads were neatly ranged along the wall where the roof was lowest. A long table covered with a white cloth, for we were luxurious on Christmas night, occupied the middle of the floor. In a corner stood a fine big barrel of Bavarian beer which had arrived that morning as a Christmas present from my mother at Leipzig. We were none of us anxious to turn out into the bitter cold, I can tell you. But we were not colonels in those days, and while the Hauptmann was proposing my mother's health, the door was thrust open and an orderly muffled up to the eyes stood on the threshold at the salute. "The Herr Oberst wishes to see the Herr Lieutenant von Altrock," said he, and before I had time even to grumble, he turned on his heels and marched away. I took down my greatcoat, drew the cape over my head, and went out of the hut. There was no wind, nor was the snow falling, but the cold was terrible, and to me who had come straight from the noise of my companions, the night seemed unnaturally still. I plodded away through the darkness. Behind me in the hut the Hauptmann struck up a song, and the words came to me quite clearly and very plaintively across the snow. Ik heiten Ihnen Kameraden, Ihnen besseren Findes du nicht. I wondered whether in the morning, like that comrade, I should be a man to be mentioned in the past tense, for more than once a sentinel had been found frozen dead at his post, and I foresaw a long night's work before me. My colonel had acquired a habit of choosing me for special services, and indeed to his kindness in this respect I owed my commission. I found him sitting at a little table drawn close to the fire in a bare, dimly lighted room. A lamp stood on the table, and he was peering at a crumbled scrap of paper and smoothing out its creases. So engrossed was he indeed in his scrutiny that it was some minutes before he raised his head and saw me waiting for his commands. "Lieutenant von Altrock," he said, "you must ride to Rancy." Rancy was only 5 miles distant as the crow flies. Yes, but the French had made a sortie on the 21st. They had pushed back our lines, and they now held Ville-Effrart and Maison Blanche between Rancy and Noisy-le-Grand. I should have to make a circuit. My 5 miles became 10. I did not like the prospect at all. I liked it still less when the colonel added, "You must be careful. More than one German soldier has of late been killed upon that road. There are francs-tireurs about, and you must reach Rancy." It was a verbal message which he gave me, and I was to deliver it in person to the commandant of the battery at Rancy. "There is a horse ready for you at the stables," said the colonel, and with a nod he turned again to his scrap of paper. I saluted and walked to the door. As my hand was on the knob he called me back. "What do you make of it?" he added, holding the paper out to me. It was picked out of the Marne in a sealed wine bottle. I took the paper and saw that a single sentence was written upon it in a round and laborious hand, with the words misspelt. The meaning of the sentence seemed simple enough. It was apparently a message from a Monsieur Bonnet to his son in the Mobiles of Paris, and it stated that the big black cat had had 5 kittens. "What do you make of it?" repeated the colonel. "Why, that Monsieur Bonnet's black cat has kittens," said I. I handed the paper back. The colonel looked at it again, shrugged his shoulders, and laughed. "Well, after all, perhaps it does mean no more than that," said he. But for the colonel's suspicions, I should not have given another thought to that misspelt scrawl. Monsieur Bonnet was probably some little peasant, engrossed in domestic affairs, who thought that no message could be more consoling to his son locked up in Paris than this great news about the black cat. The wildest rumours were flying about our camp at that time, as I think will always happen when you have a large body of men living under a great strain of cold and privation and peril. They perplexed the seasoned officers, and they were readily swallowed by the youngsters, of whom I was one. Now this scrap of paper happened to fit in with the rumour which most of all exercised our imaginations. It was known that in spite of all our precautions, news was continually leaking into Paris which we did not think it good for the Parisians to have. On that very Christmas Day they already knew that General Faidherbe at Pont Noyelles had repulsed a portion of our first army under General Manteuffel. How did they know? We were not satisfied that pigeons and balloons completely explained the mystery. No, we believed that the news passed somewhere through our lines on the southeast of Paris, news in cipher which was passed on and on to a house close to our lines, whence, as occasion served, it was carried into Paris. That was the rumour. There may have been truth in it, or it may have been entirely false, but at all events it had just the necessary element of fancy to appeal to the imagination of a very young man, and as I walked to the stables and mounted the horse which the colonel had lent me, I kept wondering whether this message, so simple in appearance, had travelled so, and was covering its last stage between the undiscovered chateau and Paris in the sealed wine bottle. I tried to make out what the black cat stood for in the cipher, and whose identity was concealed under the pseudonym of Monsieur Bonnet, so I rode down the slope of Noisy-le-Grand. But at the bottom of the slope these speculations passed entirely from my mind. In front, hidden away in the darkness, lay the dangers of Ville-Effrart and Maison Blanche. German soldiers had ridden along this path and had not returned. The francs-tireurs were abroad. Yet I must reach Francy. Moreover, in my own mind I was equally convinced that I must return. I saw the little beds against the wall of the hut under the sloping roof. I rode warily, determined to sleep in one of them that night, determined to keep my life if it could be kept. I crossed the Marne and turned off the road into a forest path. Villefort with its French garrison lay now upon my left behind the screen of trees. Fortunately there was no moon that night, and a mist hung in the air. The snow, too, deadened the sound of my horse's hoofs. But I rode nevertheless, very gently and with every sense alert. Each moment I expected the challenge of a sentinel in French. I came to the end of the wood and rode on to Chesnay. Here the country was more open, and I had passed Villefort, but I did not feel any greater security. I was possessed with the sort of rage to get my business done and live. Yes, at all costs live. A mile beyond Chesnay I came to a crossroads, and within the angle which the two roads made, a little cabin stood upon a plot of grass. I was in doubt which road to take. The cabin was all dark, and riding up to the door I hammered upon it with the butt of my pistol. It was not immediately opened. There must indeed have been some delay, since the inmates were evidently in bed, but I was not in any mood to show consideration. I wanted to get on and live. A little window was within my reach. I dashed the butt of the pistol violently through the glass. "Will that waken you, eh?" I cried, and almost before I had finished I heard a shuffling footstep in the passage, and the door was opened. A poor old peasant woman, crippled with rheumatism, stood in the doorway, shading a lighted candle with a gnarled, trembling hand. In her haste to obey, she had merely thrown a petticoat over the shoulders of her nightdress, and there she stood with bare feet, shivering in the cold, an old bent woman of 80, and apologized. "I am sorry, monsieur," she said meekly, "but I cannot move as quickly as I could when I was young. How can I serve monsieur?" Not a word of reproach about her broken window. You would think that the hardest man must have felt some remorse. I merely broke in upon her apologies with a rough demand for information. "The road upon your right leads to Chelles, monsieur," she answered. "That upon your left to Rancy." I rode off without another word. It is not a pretty description which I am giving to you, but it is a true one. That is my regret. It is a true one. I forgot that old peasant woman the moment I had passed the cabin. I thought only of the long avenues of trees which stretched across that flat country, and which could hide whole companies of francs-tireurs. I strained my eyes forwards. I listened for the sound of voices, but the first voice which I heard spoke in my own tongue. It was the voice of a sentry on the outpost of Rancy, and I could have climbed down from my saddle and hugged him to my heart. Instead, I sat impassively in my saddle and gave him the countersign. I was conducted to the quarters of the commandant of artillery, and I delivered my message. "You have come quickly," he said. "What road did you take?" "That of Chesnay and Gagny." The commandant looked queerly at me. "Did you?" said he. "You are lucky. You will return by Montfermeil and Chelles, Lieutenant von Altrock, and I will send an escort with you. Apparently we are better informed at Rancy than you at Noisy-le-Grand." "I knew there was danger, sir," I replied. "A regiment of dragoons was quartered at Rancy, and from it 2 privates and a corporal were given me for escort. In the company of these men I started back by the longer road in the rear of our lines, and it was 9:15 when I started, for I noticed the time of a clock in the commandant's quarters. I should think that it must have taken 3/4 of an hour to reach Montfermeil, for the snow was deep here and the mist very thick. Beyond Montfermeil, however, we came to higher ground. There were fewer drifts of snow, and the night began to clear, so that we made better going. We were now, of course, behind our lines, and the only risk we ran was that a few peasants armed with rifles from a battlefield, or a small band of francs-tireurs might be lurking on the chance of picking off a straggler. But that risk was not very great now that there were 4 of us. I rode therefore with an easier mind, and the first thing which entered my thoughts was, what do you think? The old peasant woman's cabin with the broken window? Not a bit of it. No, it was Monsieur Bonnet's black cat. Had Monsieur Bonnet's cat 5 kittens, or was that intended to inform the people in Paris how many companies of recruits had joined one of the French armies still in the field, say General Faidherbe at Bapaume, and so to keep up their spirits and prolong the siege? I was still puzzling over this problem when in a most solitary place I came suddenly upon a chateau with lighted windows. This was the Chateau Vilteneuve. I reined in my horse and stopped. My escort halted behind me. It was, after all, an astonishing sight. There were many chateaux about Paris then, as there are now, but not one that I had ever come across was inhabited by more than a caretaker. The owners had long since fled. Breached walls, trampled gardens, gaping roofs, and silence and desertion, that is what we meant when we spoke of a chateau near Paris in those days. But here was one with lighted windows on the first and second stories, staring out calmly on the snow as though never a Prussian soldier had crossed the Rhine. A thick clump of trees sheltered it behind, and it faced the eastern side of the long ridge of Mont Guichet, along the foot of which I rode, the side farthest from Paris. From the spot where I and my escort had halted, an open park stretched level to the door. The house had no doubt a very homelike look on that cold night. It should have spoken to me, no doubt, of the well-ordered family life and the gentle occupations of women. But I was thinking of Monsieur Bonnet's black cat. Was this solitary chateau the undiscovered last station on the underground road through which the news passed into Paris? If not, why was it still inhabited? Why did the lights blaze out upon the snow so late? I commanded my escort to be silent. We rode across the park, and halfway to the door we came upon a wire fence and a gate. There we dismounted and walked our horses. We tethered them to a tree about 20 yards from the house. I ordered one of my dragoons to go round the house and watch any door which he might find at the back. I told the other two to stay where they were, and I advanced alone to the steps. But before I had reached them, the front door was thrown open, and a girl with a lantern in her hand came out. She held the lantern high above her head and peered forward, so that the light fell full upon her hair, her face, and dress. She was a tall girl and slight of figure, with big dark eyes and a face pretty and made for laughter. It was very pale now, however, and the brows were drawn together in a frown. She wore a white evening frock which glistened in the lantern light, and over her bare shoulders she had flung a heavy black military cloak. So she stood and swung the lantern slowly from side to side as she stared into the darkness, while the lights and shadows chased each other swiftly across her white frock, her anxious face, and the waves of her fair hair. "Whom do you expect at this hour, mademoiselle?" I asked. I was quite close to her, but she had not seen me, for I stood at the bottom of the steps, and she was looking out over my head. Yet she did not start or utter any cry, only the lantern rattled in her hand. Then she stood quite still for a moment or two, and afterwards lowered her arm until the light shone upon me. "You are Prussian?" she said. "A lieutenant of foot," I answered. "You have nothing to fear." "I am not afraid," she replied quietly. "Whom do you expect?" "No one," she replied. "I thought that I heard the rattle of iron as though a horse moved, and a stirrup rang. It is lonely here since our neighbours have fled. I came out to see." "The lantern, then, was not a signal, mademoiselle?" I asked. She looked at me in perplexity, and certainly the little piece of acting I thought was very well done. "A signal?" she repeated. "To whom?" "To some man hiding in the woods of Mont Guichet. A signal to him that he may come and fetch the news for Paris, which has lately, very lately, been brought to the house." She bent forward and peered down at me, drawing the cloak closer about her neck. "You are under some strange mistake, monsieur," she said. "No news for Paris has been brought to this house by anyone." "Indeed," I answered. "And is that so?" Then I stretched out my hand and said triumphantly, "You will tell me, perhaps, that the cloak upon your shoulders is a woman's cloak?" And she laughed. It was humiliating. It is always humiliating to a young man not to be taken seriously, isn't it? There was I thinking that I had fairly cross-examined her into a trap, and she laughed indulgently, and she explained indulgently too. "The cloak I am wearing belongs to a wounded French officer who was taken prisoner and released upon parole. He is now in our house." "Then I think I will make his acquaintance," I said, and over my shoulder I called to the corporal. As he advanced to my side, a look of alarm came into the girl's face. "You are not alone," she said, and suddenly her face became wistful, and her voice began to plead. "You have not come for him? He has done no harm. He could not even if he would, and he would not, for he has given his parole." "Oh, you are not going to take him away?" "That we shall see, mademoiselle." I left one dragoon at the door. I ordered the corporal to wait in the hall, and I followed the girl up the stairs to the first floor. All her pride had gone. She led the way with a submission of manner which seemed to me only a fresh effort to quiet my suspicions. But they were not quieted. I distrusted her. I believed that I had under my fingers the proof of that rumour which flew about our camp. She stopped at a door, and as she turned the handle she said, "This is my own room, monsieur. We all use it now, for it is warmer than the others, and all our servants but one have fled." It was a pretty room, and cheery enough to one who came into it from the darkness and the snow. A piano stood open in a corner with a rug thrown upon it to protect the strings from the cold. Books lay upon the tables. Heavy curtains were drawn close over the windows. There were cushioned sofas and deep armchairs, and a good fire of logs blazed upon the hearth. These details I took in at once. Then I looked at the occupants. A young man lay stretched upon a sofa close to the fire, with a wrap covering his legs. The wrap was raised by a cradle to keep off its weight. His face must have been, I think, unusually handsome when he had his health. At the moment it was so worn and pale, and the eyes were so sunk, that all its beauty had gone. The pallor was accentuated by a small black moustache he wore and his black hair. He lay with his head supported upon a pillow and was playing a game of chess with an old lady who sat at a little table by his side. I advanced to the fire and warmed my hands at it. "You, sir, are the wounded officer on parole?" I said in French. The officer bowed. "And you, madam?" I asked of the old lady. The sight of my uniform seemed to have paralyzed her with terror. "Come, come, madam," I exclaimed impatiently. "It is a simple question." "Monsieur, you frighten her," said the young lady. "It is my aunt, the Baroness Granville." "You tell me nothing of yourself," I said to her, and she looked at me in surprise. "Since you have come with an escort to this house, I imagined you must know to whom it belonged." "I am Sophie de Villetaneuse." "Exactly," I replied, as though I had known all along and had merely asked the question to see whether she would speak the truth. "Now, mademoiselle, will you please explain to me how it is that while your neighbours have fled you remain at your château?" "It is quite simple," she answered. "My mother is bedridden. She could not be moved. She could not be left alone." "You will pardon me," said I, "if I test that statement." The wounded officer raised himself upon his elbow as though to protest, but Mademoiselle de Villetaneuse put out a hand and checked him. She showed me a face flushed with anger, but she spoke quite quietly. "I will myself take you to my mother's room." I laughed. I said, "That is just what I expected. You will take me to your mother's room and leave your friends here to make any little preparations in the way of burning awkward papers which they may think desirable. Thank you, no, I am not so easily caught." Mademoiselle Sophie was becoming irritated. "There are no awkward papers," she exclaimed. "That statement, too, I shall put to the test." I went to the door, and standing so that I could still keep an eye upon the room, I called the corporal. "You will search the house thoroughly," I said, "and quickly. Bring me word how many people you find in it. You, mademoiselle, will remain in the room with us." She shrugged her shoulders as I closed the door and came back into the room. "You were wounded, monsieur," I said to the Frenchman. "Where?" "In the sortie on Les Bergettes." "And you came here the moment you were released on your parole?" The wounded officer turned with a smile to Mademoiselle Sophie. "Yes, for here live my best friends." He took her hand, and with the Frenchman's grace he raised it to his lips and kissed it. And I was suddenly made acquainted with the relationship in which these two, youth and maid, stood to one another. Mademoiselle Sophie had cried out on the steps against the possibility that I might have come to claim my prisoner, but though she spoke no word, she was still more explicit now. With the officer that caress was plainly no more than a pretty way of saying thanks. It had the look of a habit, it was so neatly given, and he gave it without carelessness, it is true, but without warmth. But she received it very differently. He did not see, because his head was bent above her hand, but I did. I saw the look of pain in her face, the slight contraction of her shoulders and arms, as if to meet a blow. The kiss hurt her. No, not the kiss, but the finished grace with which it was given, the proof, in a word, that it was a way of saying thanks and nothing more. Here was a woman who loved and a man who did not love, and the woman knew. I resumed my questions. "Your doctor, monsieur, is in the house? At this hour? No. Ah, that is a pity." The young man lifted his head from his pillow and looked me over from head to foot with a stare of disdain. "I do not quite understand. You doubt my word, monsieur." "Why not?" I asked sharply. It was quite possible that the cradle, this rug across his legs, the pillow were all pretences. This young officer might very well have brought in a cipher message to the Château Villetaneuse. Mademoiselle Sophie might very well have waved her lantern at the door to summon a fresh messenger. "No, why should I not doubt your word?" I repeated. He turned his face to the old lady. "It is your move, Baron," he said, and she placed the piece she held upon a square of the board. Mademoiselle Sophie took her stand by the table between the players, and the game went on just as though there were no intruder in the room. It was uncomfortable for me. I shifted my feet. I tried to appear at my ease. Finally I sat down in a chair. They took no notice of me whatever. I was very glad when at last the corporal opened the door. He had searched the house. He had found no one but Madame de Villetaneuse and an old servant who was watching by her bed. "Very well," said I, and the corporal returned to the hall. Mademoiselle Sophie moved away from the chess table. She came and stood opposite to me, and though her face was still, her eyes were hard with anger. "And now perhaps you will tell me to what I owe your visit," she said. "Certainly," I returned. I fixed my eyes on her, and I said slowly, "I have come to ask for more news of Monsieur Bonnet's black cat." Mademoiselle Sophie stared as if she was not sure whether I was mad or drunk, but was very sure I was one or the other. The young Frenchman started upon his couch, with the veins swelling upon his forehead and a flushed face. "This is an insult," he cried savagely, and no less savagely I answered him. "Hold your tongue," I cried. "You forget too often that though you are on parole, you are still a prisoner." He fell back upon the sofa with a groan of pain, and the girl hurried to his side. Meanwhile, I had been looking about the room for a box or a case where the cipher messages might be hid. I saw nothing of the kind. Of course they might be hidden between the pages of a book. I went from table to table, taking them by the boards and shaking the leaves. Not a scrap of paper tumbled out. There was another door in the room besides that which led on to the landing. "Mademoiselle, what room is that?" I asked. "My bedroom," she answered simply, and with a gesture full of dignity she threw open the door. I carried the mud and snow and the grime of a camp without a scruple of remorse into that neat and pretty chamber. Mademoiselle Sophie followed me as I searched wardrobe and drawer and box. At last I came to one drawer in her dressing table which was locked. I looked suddenly at the young lady. She was watching me out of the corners of her eyes with a peculiar intentness. "Open that drawer, mademoiselle," I said. "It contains only some private things." "Open that drawer, or I burst it open." "No," she cried as I jerked the handle. "I will open it." She fetched the key out of another drawer which was unlocked, and fitted it into the lock of the dressing table. And all the while I saw that she was watching me. She meant to play me some trick, I was certain. So I watched too, and I did well to watch. She turned the key, opened the drawer, and then snatched out something with extraordinary rapidity, and ran as hard as she could to the door. Not the door through which we had entered, but a second door which gave on to the passage. She ran very fast, and she ran very lightly, and she did not stumble over a chair as I did in pursuit of her, but she had to unlatch the door and pull it open. I caught her up and closed her arms about her. It was a little carved ebony box which she held, the very thing for which I searched. "I thought so," I cried with a laugh. "Drop the box, mademoiselle. Drop it on the floor." The noise of our struggle had been heard in the next room. The Baroness rushed through the doorway. "What has happened?" she cried. "Mon Dieu, you are killing her!" "Drop that box, mademoiselle." And as I spoke she threw it away. She threw it through the doorway. She tried to throw it over the banisters of the stairs, but my arms were about hers, and it fell in the passage just beyond the door. I darted from her and picked it up. When I returned with it she was taking a gold chain from her neck. At the end of the chain hung a little gold key. This she held out to me. "Open it here," she said in a low, eager voice. The sudden change only increased my suspicions, or rather my conviction, that I had now the proof which I needed. "Why, if you are so eager to show me the contents, did you try to throw it away?" I asked. "I tried to throw it down into the hall," she answered. "My corporal would have picked it up." "Oh, what would that matter?" she exclaimed impatiently. "You would have opened it in the hall. That was what I wanted. Open it here. At all events, open it here." The very urgency of her pleading made me determined to refuse the plea. "No, you have some other ruse, mademoiselle," said I. "Perhaps you wish to gain time for your friend in the next room. No, we will return there and open it comfortably by the fire." I kept a tight hold upon the box. I shook it. To my delight, I felt that there were papers within it. I carried it back to the fireside and sat down on a chair. Mademoiselle Sophie followed me close, and as I fixed the little gold key into the lock, she laid her hand very gently upon my arm. "I beg you not to unlock that box," she said. "If you do, you will bring upon me a great humiliation, and upon yourself much remorse. There is nothing there which concerns you. There are just my little secrets. A girl may have secrets, monsieur, which are sacred to her." She was standing quite close to me, and her back was towards the French officer and her aunt. They could not see her face, and they could hardly have heard more than a word here and there of what she said. I answered her only by turning the key in the lock. She took her hand from my arm and laid it on the lid to hinder me from opening it. "I wore the key on a chain about my neck, monsieur," she whispered. "Does that teach you nothing? Even though you are young, does it teach you nothing? I said that if you unlocked that box you would cause me great humiliation, thinking that would be enough to stop you. But I see I must tell you more. Read the letters, monsieur, question me about them, and you will make my life a very lonely one. I think so. I think you will destroy my chance of happiness. You would not wish that, monsieur. It is true that we are enemies, but some day this war will end, and you would not wish to prolong its sufferings beyond the end. Yet you will be doing that, monsieur, if you open that box." It seems now almost impossible to me that I could have doubted her sincerity. She spoke with so much simplicity, and so desperate an appeal looked out from her dark eyes. Ever since that Christmas night I can see her quite clearly at will, standing as she then stood, all the sincerity of her which I would not acknowledge, all the appeal which I would not hear, and I see her many times when for my peace I would rather not. She was pleading for her pride, and to do that the better she laid her pride aside, yet she never lost her dignity. She was pleading for her chance of happiness, foreseeing that it was likely to be destroyed without any reason or any profit to a living being by a stranger who would the next moment pass out of her life. Yet there was no outcry and there were no tears. Had it been a trick, I asked the ladies, would there not have been tears? But I thought it a trick and a cheap one. She was trying to make me believe that there were love letters in the box, compromising love letters. Now I knew that there were no love letters in the box. I had seen the Frenchman's pretty way of saying thanks. I had noticed how the caress hurt her just through what it lacked. He was the friend, you see, and nothing more. She was the lover and the only lover of the pair. I opened the box accordingly. Mademoiselle Sophie turned away abruptly, and sitting down in a chair, shaded her eyes with her hand. I emptied the letters out on to a table, turning the box upside down, and thus the first which I took up and read was the one which lay at the very bottom. As I read it, it seemed that every suspicion I had formed was established. She had hinted at love letters. She had spoken of secrets sacred to a girl, and the letter was not even addressed to her. It was addressed to Madame de Villetaneuse. It was a letter which, if it meant no more than what was implied upon the surface, would have long since found destruction in the waste paper basket, for it purported to be merely the acceptance of an invitation to dinner at the town house of Madame de Villetaneuse in the Faubourg Saint Germain. It was signed only by a Christian name, Armand, and the few sentences which composed the letter explained that Monsieur Armand was a distant kinsman of Madame de Villetaneuse, and had just come to Paris to pursue his studies, and who, up till now, had no acquaintance with the family. I looked at Mademoiselle Sophie sternly. So all this pother about a mere invitation to dinner? Once let it be known that Monsieur Armand will dine with Madame de Villetaneuse in the Faubourg Saint Germain, and you are humiliated, you lose your chance of happiness, and I, too, shall find myself in good time suffering the pangs of remorse. And I read the letter slowly aloud to her, word for word. She returned no answer. She sat with her hand shading her face, and she rocked her head backwards and forwards continually and rather quickly, like a child with a racking headache. Of course, to my mind, all that was part of the game. The letter was dated 2 years back, but the month was December, and of course to antedate would be the first precaution. "Come, mademoiselle," I said, changing my tone, "I invite you very seriously to make a clean breast of it. I wish to take no harsh measures with you if I can avoid them. Tell me frankly what news this letter, plainly translated, gives to General Trochu in Paris." "None," she answered. "Very well," said I, and I took up the next letter. Ah, Monsieur Armand writes again a week later. It was evidently a good dinner, and Monsieur Armand is properly grateful. The gratitude, indeed, was rather excessive, rather provincial. It was just the effusion which a young man who had not yet learned self-possession might have written on his first introduction to the highest social life of Paris. Certainly the correspondence was very artfully designed, but what did it hide? I puzzled over the question. I took the words and the dates, and it seemed to me that I began to see light. So much stress was laid upon the dinner that the word must signify some event of importance. The first letter spoke of a dinner in the future. I imagined that it had not been possible to pass this morning into Paris. The second letter mentioned with gratitude that the dinner had been successful. Well, suppose dinner stood for engagement. The letter would refer to the sortie from Paris which pushed back our lines and captured Ville-Evrart and Maison Blanche. That seemed likely. Madame de Villetaneuse gave the dinner. General Trochu made the sortie. Then Madame de Villetaneuse stood for General Trochu. Who would be Armand? Why, the French people outside Paris, the provincials. I had the explanation of that provincial expression of gratitude. Ah, no doubt it all seems far-fetched now that we sit quietly about this table, but put yourself in the thick of the war and take 20 years off your lives. Suppose yourselves young and green, eager for advancement, and just off your balance from want of sleep, want of food, want of rest, want of everything. There are very few things which would seem far-fetched. It seemed to me that I was deciphering these letters with absolute accuracy. I saw myself promoted to captain, seconded to the staff. I went on with the letters, hoping to find an explanation there. The third letter was addressed to Mademoiselle de Villetaneuse, who had evidently written to Monsieur Armand on behalf of her mother, inviting him to her box at the opera. Monsieur Armand regretted that he had not been fortunate enough to call at a time when Mademoiselle was at home, and would look forward to the pleasure of seeing her at the opera. "Mademoiselle," I cried, "what does the opera stand for?" Mademoiselle Sophie laughed disdainfully. "For music, monsieur, for art, for refinement, for many things you do not understand." I sprang up in excitement. What did it matter what she said? Monsieur Armand stood for the army of the Loire. It was that army which had been expected at Ville-Evrart. Here was a pledge that it would come to the help of Paris at the next sortie. That was valuable news. It could not but bring recognition to the man who brought evidence of it into the Prussian lines. I hurriedly read through the other letters, quoting a passage here and there, trying to startle Mademoiselle de Villetaneuse into a confession, but she never changed her attitude. She did not answer a word. Her conduct was the more aggravating, for I began to get lost among these letters. They were all in the same handwriting, they were all signed Armand, and they seemed to give a picture of the life of a young man in Paris during the 2 years which preceded the war. They recorded dinner parties, visits to the theatres, examinations passed, prizes won and lost, receptions, rides in the Bois, and Sunday excursions into the country. All these phrases, these appointments, these meetings, might have particular meanings, But if so, how stupendous a cipher! Besides, how was it that none of these messages had been passed into Paris? Very reluctantly I began to doubt my own conjecture. I read some more letters, and then I suddenly turned back to the earlier ones. I compared them with the later notes. I began to be afraid the correspondence, after all, was genuine, for the tone of the letters changed, and changed so gradually, and yet so clearly, that the greatest literary art could hardly have deliberately composed them. I seemed to witness the actual progress of Monsieur Armand, a hobbledehoy from the provinces, losing his awkwardness, acquiring ease and polish in his contact with the refinement of Paris. The last letters had the postmark of Paris, the first that of Auvergne. They were genuine, then, and they were not love letters. I looked at Mademoiselle Sophie with an increased perplexity. Why did she now sit rocking her head like a child in pain? Why had she so struggled to hinder me from opening them? They recorded a beginning of acquaintanceship and the growth of that into friendship between a young man and a young girl, nothing more. The friendship might eventually end in marriage, no doubt, if left to itself. But there was not a word of that in the letters. I was still wondering when the French officer raised himself from his sofa and dragged himself across the room to Mademoiselle Sophie's chair. His left trouser leg had been slit down the side from the knee to the foot, and laced lightly so as to make room for a bandage. He supported himself from chair to chair with evident pain, and I could not doubt that his wound was as genuine as the letters. He bent down and gently took her hand away from her face. "Sophie," he said, "I did not dare to think that you kept this place for me in your thoughts. A little more courage, and I should long since have said to you what I say now. I beg your permission to ask Madame de Villetaneuse tomorrow for your hand in marriage." My house of cards tumbled down in a second. The French officer was Monsieur Armand. With the habit women have of treasuring tokens of the things which have happened, Mademoiselle Sophie had kept all these trifling notes and messages, and had even gathered to them the letters written to her mother, so that the story might be complete. But without Monsieur Armand's knowledge, he was not to know. Her pride must guard her secret from him, for she was the lover and he only the friend, and she knew it. Even in the little speech which he had just made, there was just too much formality, just too little sincerity of voice. I understood why she had tried to throw the ebony box down into the hall, so that I might open it there. I understood that I had caused her great humiliation, but that was not all there was for me to understand. In answer to Armand, she raised her eyes quietly and shook her head. "You wish to spare me shame," she said, "and I thank you very much. But it is because of these letters that you spoke. I must think that. I must always think it." "No," he exclaimed. "But yes," she replied firmly. "If monsieur had not unlocked that box, I don't know, but some day perhaps. Oh, not yet. No, not yet. But some day perhaps you might have come of your own accord and said what you have just said, and I should have been very happy. But now you never must, for you see I shall always think that the letters are prompting you." And Monsieur Armand bowed. I had taken from her her chance of happiness. The friendship between them might have ended in marriage if left to itself, but I had not left it to itself. "Mademoiselle," I said, "I am very sorry." She turned her dark eyes on me. "Monsieur, I warned you. It is too late to be sorry." And as I stood shuffling awkwardly from one foot to the other, in great remorse, as she had foretold, she added gently, "Will you not go, monsieur?" I went out of the room, called together my escort, mounted, and rode off. It was past midnight now, and the night was clear. But I thought neither of the little beds under the slope of the roof, nor of any danger on the road. There might have been a franc-tireur behind every tree. I would never have noticed it until one of them had brought me down. Remorse was heavy upon me. I had behaved without consideration, without chivalry, without any manners at all. I had not been able to distinguish truth when it stared me in the face, or to recognize honesty when it looked out from a young girl's dark eyes. I had behaved, in a word, like the brute 6 months of war had made of me. I wondered with a vague hope whether after all time might not set matters right between Monsieur Armand and Mademoiselle Sophie, and I wonder now whether it has. But even if I knew that it had, I should always remember that Christmas night of 1870 with acute regret. The only incident, indeed, which I can mention with the slightest satisfaction is this. On the way back to Noisy-le-Grand, I came to a point where the road from Chelles crossed the road from Montfermeil. I halted at a little cabin which stood upon a grass plot within the angle of the roads, and tying up all the money I had on me in a pocket handkerchief, I dropped the handkerchief through a broken window pane. The Colonel let the end of his cigar fall upon his plate, and pushed back his chair from the table. "But I see we shall be late for the opera," he said as he glanced at the clock. End of chapter 14. Recording by Pam Castile. Chapter 15 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pam Castile. Princess Mary's Gift Book. Chapter 15. A Spell for a Fairy by Alfred Noes. Gather first in your left hand, this must be at fall of day, 40 grains of yellow sand, where you think a mermaid lay. I have heard a wizard hint, it is best to gather it sweet, out of the warm and fluttered dent, where you see her heart has beat. Out of the dent in that sweet sand, gather 40 grains, I say. Yet if it fail you, understand, I can show you a better way. Out of that sand you melt your glass, while the veils of night are drawn, whispering till the shadows pass, Nixie, pixie, leprechaun. Then you blow your magic vial, shape it like a crescent moon, set it up and make your trial, singing, "Fairies, ah, come soon." Round the cloudy crescent go, on the hilltop in the dawn, singing softly on tiptoe, "Elebe Gathon, Elebe Gathon, Nixie pixie leprechaun." Bring the blood of a white hen, killed about the break of day, while the cock in the echoing glen thrust his gold neck every way. Over the brambles peering, calling, under the ferns with a sudden fear, far and wide while the dews are falling, clamoring, calling everywhere. Round the crimson vial go, on the hilltop in the dawn, singing softly on tiptoe, "Nixie pixie leprechaun." And if once will not suffice, do it thrice. If this fails at break of day, I can show you a better way. Bring the buds of the hazel copse, where two lovers kissed at noon. Bring the crushed red wild thyme tops, where they walked beneath the moon. Bring the four-leaved clover also, one of the white and one of the red, mixed with the flakes of the May that fall so lightly over the skylark's bed. Round the fragrant vial go, on the hilltop in the dawn, singing softly on tiptoe, "Nixie pixie leprechaun." If this fail at break of day, I can show you a better way. Bring an old and wizened child, ah, tread softly and speak low, tattered, tearless wonder wild, from that under world below. Bring a withered child of 7, reeking from the city slime, out of hell into your heaven, set her knee-deep in the thyme. Bring her from the smoky city, set her on a fairy throne, clothe her, feed her of your pity, leave her for an hour alone. You shall need no spells or charms on that hilltop in that dawn. When she lifts her wasted arms, you shall see a veil withdrawn. There shall be no veil between them, though her head be old and wise. You shall know that she has seen them by the glory in her eyes. Round her irons on the hill, earth shall toss a fairy fire. Watch and listen and be still, lest you balk your own desire. When she sees 4 azure wings light upon her claw-like hand, when she lifts her head and sings, you shall hear and understand. You shall hear a bugle calling wildly over the dew-dashed down, and a sound as of the falling ramparts of a conquered town. You shall hear a sound like thunder, and a veil shall be withdrawn, when her eyes grow wide with wonder on that hilltop in that dawn. End of chapter 15. Recording by Pam Castile.
Chapter 16 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Princess Mary's Gift Book, Chapter 16, Out of the Jaws of Death, a Scarlet Pimpernel story by Baroness Orczy. We were such a happy family before this terrible revolution broke out. We lived rather simply but very comfortably in our dear old home just on the borders of the forest of Compiègne. Jean and André were the twins. Just 15 years old they were when King Louis was deposed from the throne of France, which God had given him, and went to prison like a common criminal, with our beautiful Queen Marie Antoinette and the royal children, and Madame Elizabeth, who was so beloved by the poor. Ah, that seems very, very long ago now. No doubt you know better than I do all that happened in our beautiful land of France, and in lovely Paris about that time. Goods and property confiscated, innocent men, women, and children condemned to death for acts of treason which they had never committed. It was in August last year that they came to Mont Repos and arrested Papa, Mamma, and us 4 young ones and dragged us to Paris, where we were imprisoned in a narrow and horrible, dank vault in the Abbaye, where all day and night through the humid stone walls we heard the cries and sobs and moans from poor people, who no doubt were suffering the same sorrows and the same indignities as we were. I had just passed my 19th birthday, and Marguerite was only 13. Maman was a perfect angel during that terrible time. She kept up our courage and our faith in God in a way that no one else could have done. Every night and morning we knelt round her knee, and Papa sat close beside her, and we prayed to God for deliverance from our own afflictions, and for the poor people who were crying and moaning all the day. But of what went on outside our prison walls we had not an idea, though sometimes poor Papa would brave the warder's brutalities and ask him questions of what was happening in Paris every day. "They are hanging all the aristos to the street lamps of the city," the man would reply with a cruel laugh, "and it will be your turn next." We had been in prison for about a fortnight. Then one day, oh, shall I ever forget it? We heard in the distance a noise like the rumbling of thunder. Nearer and nearer it came, and soon the sound became less confused. Cries and shrieks could be heard above that rumbling din, but so weird and menacing did those cries seem that instinctively, though none of us knew what they meant, we all felt a nameless terror grip our hearts. Oh, I am not going to attempt the awful task of describing to you all the horrors of that never to be forgotten day. People who today cannot speak without a shudder of the September massacres have not the remotest conception of what really happened on that truly awful second day of the month. We are all at peace and happy now, but whenever my thoughts fly back to that morning, whenever the ears of memory recall those hideous yells of fury and of hate, coupled with the equally horrible cries for pity which pierced through the walls behind which the 6 of us were crouching, trembling and praying, whenever I think of it, All my heart still beats violently with that same nameless dread which held it in its deathly grip then. Hundreds of men, women, and children were massacred in the prisons of Paris on that day. It was a St. Bartholomew even more hideous than the last. Maman was trying in vain to keep our thoughts fixed upon God. Papa sat on the stone bench, his elbows resting on his knees, his head buried in his hands, but Maman was kneeling on the floor with her dear arms encircling us all, and her trembling lips moving in continuous prayer. We felt that we were facing death, and what a death! Oh, my God! Suddenly the small grated window, high up in the dank wall, became obscured. I was the first to look up, but the cry of terror which rose from my heart was choked ere it reached my throat. Jean and André looked up too, and they shrieked, and so did Marguerite, and Papa jumped up and ran to us, and stood suddenly between us and the window like a tiger defending its young. The children did not even cry. They stared wide-eyed, paralyzed with fear. Only Maman continued to pray, and we could hear Papa's rapid and stertorous breathing as he watched what was going on in that window above. Heavy blows were falling against the masonry round the grating, and we could hear the nerve-racking sound of a file working on those iron bars, and farther away below the window those awful yells of human beings transformed by hate and fury into savage beasts. How long this horrible suspense lasted I cannot now tell you. The next thing I remember clearly is a number of men in horrible ragged clothing pouring into our vault-like prison from the window above. The next moment they rushed at us simultaneously, or so it seemed to me, for I was just then recommending my soul to God, so certain was I that in that same second I would cease to live. It was all like a dream, for instead of the horrible shriek of satisfied hate which we were all expecting to hear, a whispered voice, commanding and low, struck our ear and dragged us, as it were, from out of the abyss of despair into the sudden light of hope. "If you will trust us," the voice whispered, "and not be afraid, you will be safely out of Paris within an hour." Papa was the first to realize what was happening. He had never lost his presence of mind, even during the darkest moments of this terrible time, and he said quite calmly and steadily now, "What must we do?" "Persuade the little ones not to be afraid, not to cry, to be as still and silent as may be," continued the voice, which I felt must be that of one of God's own angels, so exquisitely kind did it sound to my ear. "They will be quiet and still without persuasion," said Papa. "Eh, children?" And Jean, André, and Marguerite murmured, "Yes," while Maman and I drew them closer to us, and said everything we could think of to make them still more brave. And the whispering, commanding voice went on after a while. "Now, will you allow yourselves to be muffled and bound? And after that will you swear that whatever happens, whatever you may see or hear, you will neither move nor speak? Not only your own lives, but those of many brave men will depend upon your fulfilment of this oath." Papa made no reply save to raise his hand and his eyes up to where God surely was watching over us all. Maman said in her gentle, even voice, "For myself and my children, I swear to do all that you tell us." A great feeling of confidence had entered into her heart, just as it had done into mine. We looked at one another and knew that we were both thinking the same thing. We were thinking of the brave Englishman and his gallant little band of heroes about whom we had heard many wonderful tales of how they had rescued a number of innocent people who were unjustly threatened with the guillotine. And we all knew that the tall figure, disguised in horrible rags, who spoke to us with such a gentle yet commanding voice, was the man whom rumor credited with supernatural powers, and who was known by the mysterious name of the Scarlet Pimpernel. Hardly had we sworn to do his bidding than his friends most unceremoniously threw great pieces of sacking over our heads, and then proceeded to tie ropes round our bodies. At least I know that that is what one of them was doing to me, and from one or two whispered words of command which reached my ear I concluded that Papa and Maman and the children were being dealt with in the same summary way. I felt hot and stifled under that rough bit of sacking, but I would not have moved or even sighed for worlds. Strangely enough, as soon as my eyes and ears were shut off from the sights and sounds immediately round me, I once more became conscious of the horrible and awful din which was going on not only on the other side of our prison walls, but inside the whole of the Abbaye building and in the street beyond. Once more I heard those terrible howls of rage and of satisfied hatred uttered by the assassins who were being paid by the government of our beautiful country to butcher helpless prisoners in their hundreds. Suddenly I felt myself hoisted up off my feet and slung up onto a pair of shoulders that must have been very powerful indeed, for I am no light weight, and once more I heard the voice, the very sound of which was delight, quite close to my ear this time, giving a brief and comprehensive command. All ready. Remember your part. En avant. And then it added in English, Here, Tony, you start kicking against the door whilst we begin to shout. I loved those few words of English, and hoped that Maman had heard them too, for it would confirm her, as it did me, in the happy knowledge that God and a brave man had taken our rescue in hand. But from that moment we might all have been in the very antechamber of hell. I could hear the violent kicks against the heavy door of our prison, and our brave rescuers seemed suddenly to be transformed into a cage full of wild beasts. Their shouts and yells were as horrible as any that came to us from the outside, and I must say that the gentle firm voice which I had learned to love was as execrable as any I could hear. Apparently the door would not yield, as the blows against it became more and more violent, and presently, from somewhere above my head, the window presumably, came a rough call and a raucous laugh. "Why, what in the name of is happening here?" And the voice near me answered back equally roughly, "A quarry of 6, but we are caught in this trap. Get the door open for us, citizen. We want to be rid of this booty and go in search for more." A horrible laugh was the reply from above, and the next instant I heard a terrific crash. The door had at last been burst open either from within or without, I could not tell which, and suddenly all the din, the cries, the groans, the hideous laughter and bibulous songs which had sounded muffled up to now, burst upon us with all their hideousness. That was, I think, the most awful moment of that truly fearful hour. I could not have moved then, even had I wished or been able to do so, but I knew that between us all and a horrible, yelling, murdering mob there was now nothing, except the hand of God and the heroism of a band of English gentlemen. Together they gave a cry, as loud, as terrifying as any that were being uttered by the butchering crowd in the building, and with a wild rush they seemed to plunge with us straight into the middle of the awful mêlée. At least, that is what it all felt like to me, and afterwards I heard from our gallant rescuer himself that that is exactly what he and his friends did. There were 8 of them altogether, and we 4 young ones had each been hoisted on a pair of devoted shoulders, while Maman and Papa were each carried by 2 men. I was lying across the finest pair of shoulders in the world, and close to me was beating the bravest heart on God's earth. Thus burdened, these 8 noble English gentlemen charged right through an army of butchering, howling brutes, they themselves howling with the fiercest of them. All around me I heard weird and terrifying cries. "What ho, citizen, what have you there?" "6 aristos!" shouted my hero boldly as he rushed on, forcing his way through the crowd. "What are you doing with them?" yelled a raucous voice. "Food for the starving fish in the river," was the ready response. "Stand aside, citizen," he added with a round curse. "I have my orders from First Citizen Danton himself about these 6 aristos. You hinder me at your peril." He was challenged over and over again in the same way, and so were his friends who were carrying Papa and Maman and the children, but they were always ready with a reply. With eyes that could not see, one could imagine them as hideous, as vengeful, as cruel as the rest of the crowd. I think that soon I must have fainted from sheer excitement and terror, for I remembered nothing more till I felt myself deposited on a hard floor, propped against the wall, and the stifling piece of sacking taken off my head and face. I looked around me, dazed and bewildered. Gradually the horrors of the past hour came back to me, and I had to close my eyes again, for I felt sick and giddy with the sheer memory of it all. But presently I felt stronger, and looked around me again. Jean and André were squatting in a corner close by, gazing wide-eyed at the group of men in filthy ragged clothing who sat round a deal table in the centre of a small, ill-furnished room. Maman was lying on a horse-haired sofa at the other end of the room, with Marguerite beside her, and Papa sat in a low chair by her, holding her hand. The voice I loved was speaking in its quaint, somewhat drawly cadence. "You are quite safe now, my dear Monsieur le Messier," it said. "After Madame and the young people have had a rest, some of my friends will find you suitable disguises, and they will escort you out of Paris, as they have some really genuine passports in their possession, which we obtain from time to time through the agency of a personage highly placed in this murdering government, and with the help of English banknotes. Those passports are not always unchallenged, I must confess," added my hero with a quaint laugh, "but to-night every one is busy murdering in one part of Paris, so the other parts are comparatively safe." Then he turned to one of his friends and spoke to him in English. "You had better see this through, Tony," he said, "with Hastings and Mackenzie. 3 of you will be enough. I shall have need of the others." No one seemed to question his orders. He had spoken, and the others made ready to obey. Just then Papa spoke up. "How are we going to thank you, sir?" he asked, speaking broken English, but with his habitual dignity of manner. "By leaving your welfare in our hands, monsieur. replied our gallant rescuer quietly. Papa tried to speak again, but the Englishman put up his hand to stop any further talk. "There is no time now, monsieur," he said with gentle courtesy. "I must leave you, as I have much work yet to do." "Where are you going, Blakeney?" asked one of the others. "Back to the Abbaye prison," he said. "There are other women and children to be rescued there." End of Chapter 6. Recording by Todd.
Chapter 17 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. Princess Mary's Gift Book. Chapter 17. What Can a Little Chap Do? By John Oxenham. What can a little chap do for his country and for you? What can a little chap do? He can fight like a knight for the truth and the right. That's one good thing he can do. He can shun all that's mean. He can keep himself clean, both without and within. That's another good thing he can do. His soul he can brace against everything base, and the trace will be seen all his life in his face. That's a very fine thing he can do. He can look to the light. He can keep his thought white. He can fight the great fight. He can do with his might what is good in God's sight. Those are excellent things he can do. Though his years be but few, he can march in the queue of the good and the great, who battled with fate and won through. That's a wonderful thing he can do. And in each little thing he can follow the King. Yes, in each smallest thing he can follow the King. He can follow the Christ, the King. End of Chapter 17. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Chapter 18 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabriel Glenn. Princess Mary's Gift Book, Chapter 18, Altogether Different, by W. Pett Ridge. I knew a child who... Some friends of mine have a daughter, and she... Not very many years ago, I remember hearing... Once upon a time. That is the proper way to begin this story. Once upon a time, there was a little girl of about the usual age who lived near to St. John's Wood Road Station, handy to Lord's Cricket Ground and not far from the Zoological Gardens. You would think that anyone who, in the summer, could look out of her window and see Mr. P.F. Warner batting, and in the winter was able to go any afternoon she liked to watch the lions and tigers take high tea at 4, ought to have been as happy as the days were long, cheerful even when the days were short. Yet she was not entirely satisfied. It may be said that her one failing was a spirit of discontent. When grown-ups are discontented, it is called ambition, but that is another matter. On a certain Tuesday evening in November, it happened that she felt quite pleased with the world until about 7 o'clock. 7 in the evening was the hour that frequently made her peevish. Nurse left her alone for a minute to see if everything was ready upstairs, and in that minute the little girl jumped on a chair and moved back the long hand. She was reading her picture book with great interest when Nurse returned. "Bless my soul!" cried Nurse. quite thought it wanted 10 to 7, and here it is only 10 past 6. I shall find myself in Colney Hatch before I'm much older." The little girl wanted to assure Nana there was no good reason to assume that mental decay had set in, but she did not do this at once, and afterwards it seemed too late. So Nurse was allowed to chat on and tell her very best story about the time when she was a child, and a very good one at that, and when the clock, having been compelled to go over the ground twice, again gave the time as 10 to 7, Nurse said, "Now, my dearie." Upstairs, the little girl devoted a few minutes to instructing her dolly in the art of going off nicely to bye-byes. She was left alone with just a mere star of gaslight for company shining above the dressing table, and at the moment when she was about to go to sleep, Conscience woke up. Conscience became wide awake. Conscience insisted upon talking, and the little girl had to listen. She was aware it is useless to cry when one is by oneself with nobody looking on. Not only useless but wasteful, because you may want those tears on more important and more public occasions. So the little girl did not weep, but oh, she felt troubled. She did feel troubled. "A silly, stupid world," she cried aloud. It ought to be changed. I'd very much love it to be altogether different." A knock at her door, and she answered, "Please come in, Nana." Not Nurse. Certainly the tall lady with diamonds sparkling in her hair, and a white chiffon kind of costume, and a long silver stick in the right hand, was as unlike Nurse as anyone could be. The little girl said, "Oh, I beg pardon," in her politest manner. "It is for me to beg yours," answered the tall lady with severity. "I am exceedingly sorry to disturb you." "Pray don't mention it." "I wish to mention it," insisted the lady. "I claim the right to mention it. I decline to allow anyone to dictate to me what I shall or what I shall not mention. I am a good fairy." The little girl opened her mouth with surprise. "A good fairy, and I'm here to do you a favor. When a good fairy wishes to do a favor, it is only necessary for a wish to be expressed, and—" "Thank you," said the child nervously, "but I would so much rather you did not take the trouble." "The trouble," replied the good fairy, striking the floor with her silver stick in an impatient way, "is no concern of yours. You mustn't haggle." "I don't know what that means," declared the other earnestly, "and if I did, I wouldn't do it, ma'am. I wouldn't really. Good evening, and of course thank you ever so much for calling." "Dress," ordered the good fairy. On the instant something happened which the little girl had often thought about. More than once she had talked it over with Nurse. She found herself, in the space of less time than it takes to click your finger and thumb, fully and completely costumed, boots laced up, hair taken out of curlers and properly brushed, hat set at the correct angle, parasol in hand, gloves buttoned, and everything ready for a walk out of doors. She gave a cry of delight and astonishment. "I am about to give you the great treat of your life," said the fairy. "Something that no one has ever yet experienced. Something that will give you a subject to talk about for the rest of your days. Nobody will believe you, but that must be endured. You are about to see the world as nobody else has seen it. And if you ask me why you have been selected for this high and special honor, please, I don't. My answer is," taking no notice of the interruption, "that you are receiving the award for your wonderful discovery." "But I have discovered nothing." "Nothing?" echoed the lady with amazement. "You call it nothing to have found out the secret that has puzzled clever people for thousands and thousands of years? How often folk have said, 'If only I could live some part of my life over again,' and they never have been able to do it. You, child, were the first." The staircase had always gone straight down until it neared the next landing, where it took a slight curve. Now it was all curves, and had nothing about it that could be called straight. It went up, it went down, it went to the left, it went to the right, so that wherever you put your foot expecting to find a step, you did not find it, and wherever you put your foot expecting to find nothing, you hurt your toes. "This is very strange, ma'am." "That," replied the other, "should be its great attraction. Don't lag. We shall get to the end of the staircase in less than 10 minutes." Going out of the street doorway proved one of the most difficult tasks. The fairy did not seem to mind, but the child found it extremely odd that when you pulled at the door it opened outwards, and that when you pushed at it, it came in. The iron gate which led to the pavement had another form of behavior. Determined not to be bothered here, she gave a touch with her boot, and instantly the iron gate offered her boot a pinch. She placed her hand upon it, and the gate gripped it, much in the way that Uncle Henry did when he said, "How do you do?" She put her back against it, and the iron gate gave her a clutch around the waist, and said in rasping tones as it waltzed to the pavement, "Do you reverse?" It was then that she perceived the fairy had left her. A pavement is expected to behave in a calm and demure manner. Even when it takes you uphill, it does this in the gentlest way. But this pavement, so soon as the little girl set foot upon it, at once changed to something like a switchback, and a switchback, mark you, she enjoyed when seated on a trolley at Shepherd's Bush exhibitions. It was less agreeable to try to walk up and down the uneven paths here. Other people did not seem to experience her difficulties, and this she failed to understand until she observed that they went along on their hands and toes, pretending to have 4 legs. She tried the same method, and found it made her back ache. Discovered, too, that she could not see so much as when walking in the old way. Thus it was that she had reached the end of the road, where a steep ascent occurred that was like the side of a mountain. Here she noticed something strange and peculiar about the houses. "How very foolish of them to build in that way," she cried. "They must be out of their senses." It was the more eccentric in that her own house, so far as she had observed, had not changed. Thinking it over, though, she could not be quite sure. Here at any rate was every house upside down, with the front door right away at the top, Virginia creepers growing downwards. At one house the painters were seeing to the front, and their ladders came from the roof, which was the basement, nearly to the basement, which was the roof. A neat lawn hung out over the top of each house. It made her feel giddy to think of the risks of playing croquet there. She could not see how one would be able to make even the first hoop. Other things claimed her attention. There were carts with horses pushing them. She had often heard her father reprove her eldest brother for doing this in an argument. The horses stood upright and wore silk hats in a rakish sort of way, sometimes lifting these on meeting another horse, and taking cigars out of mouths. She spoke to a constable who wore a helmet on each hand, and put an urgent inquiry. "Meow," said the policeman. "You didn't quite understand," remarked the little girl patiently. "I asked you if you would kindly tell me the way to get home to Wellington Road." "Bah! Bah!" "Do please listen to me," she begged, "and tell me what I want to know. I think I've lost my way, and I'm so afraid that I'm going to cry." "Moo," said the constable. "Please, please," she cried, "please don't be silly. Why do you keep making noises like that instead of giving me a proper answer?" "Missy," he explained, "I'm a comic policeman. I'm not here to tell folk the way, or to lock them up, or anything of that kind. I'm here to make people laugh." "You are not amusing me." "Not when I make a noise like a dog?" he asked with surprise. "Why, that nearly always sends people into a good temper. You wait till I give you my imitation of a railway engine. Hark!" He set his teeth together and began to say, "Ishak, ishak, ishak," but the little girl turned away. She felt so indignant that she determined to tell her father about it at the very first opportunity, and see whether something could not be done. More than once her father had helped to straighten out tangled matters by simply writing a letter to the newspapers and signing himself an indignant ratepayer. And at the very moment along came her father. He, too, walked on all fours as other people did, and the little girl thought it caused him to look particularly undignified. But she did not trouble about this, for, stout as he was, she was really glad to see him. "How do you do?" he said respectfully. "Can you give me a penny to buy some sweeties?" "Daddy dear," she cried with distress, "don't you begin to be funny, please." "I'm not," he said, "but you are my parent, you know." "Yes," he sighed, "I'm aware of that." "But under the new rules, you must have heard all about them. Under the new rules, parents have to be obedient to their children and do everything their children tell them to do." "Not a bad idea," decided the little girl after giving it consideration. "I think, if you don't mind, I will get you to come along now to Finchley Road and buy for me the mechanical rocking horse that has been talked about for some time." "Under the old arrangement," he replied readily, "I should have been only too pleased. But the new rules say that children must buy presents for their father and mother." "How can we?" Getting rather cross. "How in the world can we when we have no money?" "I think," he said, "that it is expected you should go to work and earn some." "Never heard such nonsense in the whole course of my life," she declared, using a grown-up remark. "It's perfect rubbish." "Do you mean to say that I shall have to go to concerts and sing as mamma does?" "That's the idea, I believe." "But I can't sing. I can't sing nearly well enough to earn money." "Well," said her father, after considering the matter, "what about going out as charwoman? You'd get 2 shillings a day and your lunch." She stood there for a few minutes, not daring to speak, and overcome with cares and responsibilities. Someone touched her on the shoulder, and she looked up. "Good fairy!" she cried. "Do you like the altogether different you asked for?" "No," she answered, "I don't like it at all. I wish now I hadn't put back the hands of the clock." "You mean to say that that was how you did it? You dare to tell me it was nothing cleverer than that? Now, just to punish you," said the fairy, speaking with stern decision, "I shall send you away to the old sort of world, and you'll simply have to make the best of it." The bedroom door opened, and nurse came in. The little girl, snuggling down into her warm, comfortable bed, kept her eyes shut. "Bless her," said nurse to herself, "sleeping as sound as a top. That's what comes of having nothing on your mind to worry you." End of chapter 18. Recording by Gabriel Glenn. Chapter 19 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabriel Glenn. Princess Mary's Gift Book, Chapter 19, The Escape, A Girl's Story from Gallant Belgium, by Annie S. Swan. Not a sound broke the exquisite hush of the early morning. The old courtyard, with its tiled pavement, its cool fountain, and its cooing doves, the dog asleep in the sunshine, made a picture of perfect peace. The house, once the chateau of a great family that had fallen on evil days, was grey and old and beautiful still, though now merely une pension de demoiselles. It was August, when, as a rule, all the merry throng had scattered from the chateau to their respective homes, leaving it to its former dignity and quiet. Mademoiselle usually went to England, perhaps seeking fresh pupils, or to enjoy the sea breezes on the Normandy coast. La Croyade, in the village of Coutane, was inland from the sea, about 15 miles from Brussels. It was a sweet spot, beloved of the understanding traveler, and many came to look at the fine old church, whose spire and windows were among the treasures known to lovers of the beautiful all over the world. Mademoiselle Ledru had nothing to complain of in her lot, with which she had been hitherto content. Success had flown in upon her earnest efforts, though looking at her anxious face that summer morning, one would have thought her oppressed by care. She was an elderly woman now, with the remains of beauty still on her face. The place where she stood that morning, before her household was astir, was certainly unusual, being the square tower of the chateau, from whose low ramparts she was sweeping the horizon with a powerful glass. It was all very peaceful and beautiful, a wide rolling plateau with fields white to harvest, not a hint of approaching desolation on its smiling face. It was very early, hardly an hour past daybreak, but already some of the thrifty peasants were busy in the fields. Far away on the red horizon there was a slight haze, regarding which Mademoiselle seemed more than a little curious. Again and again she focused her glass, until confident that the haze was not altogether stationary, but moved and broke and thickened again. Then, with a sickening apprehension at her heart, she turned and fled down the stairs and went to open the big door of the chateau. Jules, the fat and sleepy porter, was undoing the bolts as she got down. "Bonjour, mademoiselle. Someone is at the gate, an early visitor." He chuckled as he undid the last bolt and threw wide the door. When he would have hobbled across the courtyard to open the gate, his mistress was before him. When she undid the bolts, the curé, bareheaded, stood before her. "Ah, mademoiselle, it is bad news," he said in a firm voice, though his face was tense with apprehension. "They come, the barbarians. I have information. Now it behooves us to consult what we will do." Mademoiselle whitened to the lips and drew him in and shut the door. She signed to Jules to depart, but the curé intervened. "Let him stay. It will save a twice-told tale. I have certain news that they are not more than a couple of hours' march away, and for sure they will come this way to Brussels. What shall we do?" "I will remain at my post," answered Julie Ledru firmly. "I have no fear for myself, but my charges, father, Rosalie and Biddy, with whom their English parents have trusted me. My spirit fails. What must we do with them?" "It will not be safe to leave them here, mademoiselle, nor even for you to stay. We will take you to the crypt of the church, where, with a little food and drink, you will be safe until they have passed through. We have no treasure here in Coutane, and are simple folk. Perhaps we shall be beneath their notice." Julie Ledru clasped her hands in an ecstasy of apprehension. They had been without newspapers for 4 days, but chance travelers from the East had brought strange and appalling tales of the invaders' desolating march. They told of ruined villages and burning homes, and helpless people mercilessly shot down in places as simple and as unimportant as Coutane. Julie Ledru looked around her little domain with a kind of sad pride. It did not contain many treasures, it is true, but it was her home, enshrined by many sweet memories. It contained her all. "Now, father?" she asked feverishly. "Do you think we should come now?" "Without a moment's delay," he answered. "Go and get your charges roused, and bring all with you. A little food also in a basket, lest you have to stop there several days." "You will be with us, father?" said Julie anxiously. He shook his head. "My place is in the open street with such of my people as feel strong and brave in their innocence and faith. But you have English charges. If it was known, mademoiselle, believe me, nothing would save them or you. Their fury against the English is so great." "Shall we take Jules? Besides him, there's only our faithful Babette." Before the curé could reply, Jules intervened, scratching his old gray head. "I hide not from them, mademoiselle. I will stay and guard the chateau and keep them out if I can, barbarians that they are, making war on women and children." "They will shoot you, Jules, if you are so foolish," his mistress reminded him. His answer was a shrug of the shoulders. "A man dies but once, that is to say, a good man who has faith in God and does his duty." So saying, Jules went back to take up his waiting duty. The curé departed the way he had come, and Julie Ledru, with a feeling of strange calm upon her, hurried indoors to make her few simple preparations. Babette, the elderly servant, one of the best of the old Brabant type, was cool and ready for any emergency, and in an incredibly short time they had packed some food and a few necessaries in 2 considerable baskets. Then Mademoiselle Ledru essayed the task she dreaded, that of awakening her 2 young charges and preparing them for the ordeal through which they had to pass. They were still asleep, in 2 beds side by side in one of the pleasantest rooms of the chateau. Rosalie Bentham, fair and rosy like an English flower, her golden hair lying on her pillow like an aureole, and Biddy Connaught, the dark-eyed Irish girl, whose long black lashes swept her cheek, while her dimpled chin was in her open palm as she smiled over some passing imagery of a dream. Something caught Julie Ledru's throat as she regarded these 2 pictures of innocence and beauty, and reflected on the greatness of her charge. Both were only children, entrusted to her care in the holidays because their parents, both in the exercise of duty, could not take them home. But with a strong effort she controlled herself and awakened them gently. It was a process of some length, because the sleep of youth is sound and deep, but at last they were sitting up, drinking in her news. "We have to run away and hide in the crypt until the Germans have marched through the village. Do you hear, Biddy?" called Rosalie as she sprang from her bed and began to get into her clothes. "But how ripping! What lots we shall all have to write about and to tell them when we get home." Julie Ledru faintly, tremendously smiled, and with her own hands she assisted them to make a hasty toilet. Some coffee was ready for them downstairs, for Babette was a methodical person, not easily upset. Thus fortified, they left the chateau presently, leaving Babette and Jules in charge. Babette made the same excuse. Some one must stay to guard the place, and surely when they found nobody but 2 simple old servants, they would pass on. Julie had no time to argue. Perhaps even she did not fully realize the peril to which these 2 faithful souls thus willingly exposed themselves. She looked back on their serene faces as she passed through the gate, and it was the last time she was to look on them in life. She never saw them again, nor found them. They disappeared in the ruins of La Royale, as many had disappeared in other ruins, leaving no trace behind. At the church, which was but a few paces off, they found the curé busily arranging shelter. It was a very tiny village, and the number of those willing to accept the shelter he offered, and indeed advised, was comparatively few. For though simple, they were a brave people, nor could they conceive of a wickedness and barbarity that would seek to destroy innocent souls who had naught to do with war. So they went about their ordinary avocations as usual, a trifle more apprehensively perhaps, but none the less bravely, and the morning wore on. The curé took his charges, about 20 souls in all, down the narrow stairs to the crypt, where he had already provided light and such small comforts as he could spare from his own store. "Isn't it ripping, Biddy?" asked Rosalie, but perhaps her young voice had lost a little of its gallant ring. But Biddy, who had the imaginative temperament of her race, shivered a little and burst into tears. It was strange and ominous to come in out of the warm, hopeful sunshine to this place of tombs, an adventure with which the child could very well have dispensed. The church was very old, and many who had been born in Coutane had never seen the crypt. Its very existence was unknown to a large number, and the entrance to it was so cunningly arranged and so difficult of access that it was, of all hiding places in the village, the most secure. Then there was always the belief, founded on all precedent of war, that the sacred things would be respected, and sanctuary in God's house left undesecrated. The hours seemed long down there, and the stillness profound. Not a sound from the upper air penetrated to that strange hiding place. Though sure of their sanctuary, it seemed natural to lower their voices, to move softly, and even to watch apprehensively. Even the 2 girls, usually so high-spirited, found themselves naturally becoming quiet. It was only the very little children, of whom there were 5, who, unconscious of danger, crowed and laughed and babbled in their usual glee. These little ones provided incessant interest and occupation for the 2 girls, and Julie Ledru smiled as she watched their pretty efforts to amuse and keep them quiet. She had brought her watch, and it pointed to 9 o'clock at the moment when they heard a dull thud, several times repeated, which caused them all to start and look at one another in quick alarm. "It's the guns!" said old Monsieur Rollin, whose legs were twisted with rheumatism so that they had half carried him down the steps of the crypt. "They have come and are starting their fiendish work." No one could gainsay him, and for the next half hour they had to listen to a repetition of the same sound, gradually getting nearer and nearer. Presently their terror was increased by the deafening roar of artillery much nearer, and the sound of falling masonry, indicating that the church itself, cradle and sanctuary of the life of Coutane for centuries, had not been respected. The two English girls, now thoroughly frightened, clung together fearfully, and the whole little company, some of them on their knees, did not exchange a word. After a time the firing ceased, and they were left to absolute stillness, but none of them moved or offered to go up to discover what had actually happened in the village. After what seemed an interminable interval, in reality it was not more than a couple of hours from the moment the din ceased overhead, the door of the crypt was cautiously opened, and the curé looked in. He was all dishevelled, his face blackened with smoke, and his whole appearance that of a man who had seen some terrible and haunting vision. "Ah, there you are, my children," he cried, as they crowded round him. "I think you may come up presently, but be prepared to have your hearts broken. A regiment of the enemy has passed through and left nothing behind. Mademoiselle, the chateau is in flames, and the beautiful spire of the church has been blown to pieces, and at the Marais the devastation is complete. But above all, we mourn the death of so many helpless people. I myself escaped by a miracle." "Have they gone?" asked Mademoiselle with a shivering breath. "They have, and I think that they are pursued, and that this was the hurried work of destruction prompted by hatred and revenge. Will you come up now and see for yourselves, or remain here in the safety through the night?" "Alas, you will find no other refuge, mademoiselle, for your home is in ruins." Such fear was upon them that with one accord they determined to remain in the crypt until the dawn of another day. Even the natural gaiety and high spirits of youth were not proof against the terror which all felt might swoop down upon them again at any moment. They had arranged themselves as comfortably as possible to pass the night, when they were suddenly disturbed by the grating of a door and the swinging of a lantern. All scrambled to their feet, some of them shrieking and hiding their eyes, certain that there had been a fresh arrival of the invaders, and that instant death would meet them. But once more the curé smiled upon them reassuringly. "Courage, my children! Our trouble is for the moment at an end. Our own brave soldiers have arrived. It is as I said, they are in pursuit, but part of them will camp here tonight. Alas, we have little or no food to offer them, for the barbarians stripped the village of everything." Then Julie Ledru, hurriedly throwing on her cloak, said she would ascend with the curé and give what stores she could from the chateau. "But it is no more, my daughter. You have forgotten how I told you yesterday that they have burned it to the ground? But my stores are hidden in the grotto in the garden, and there is a secret passage to it. I think, father, they had not time, or did not take it, to explore, and we shall find things there. I have been putting them away since the war began." So in the pearly dawn a strange sight was to be seen in the trampled, desecrated garden of the chateau behind its smoking ruins. Led by Julie Ledru, the commandant of the troops that had halted in the village found stores sufficient to help assuage the hunger of his men. He was profuse in his thanks. "What can I do for you in exchange, mademoiselle?" he asked, as he stood at the salute. Instantly mademoiselle pointed to her charges, who, still shivering a little with fear, yet profoundly, poignantly interested in the extraordinary scene of desolation, in what but a few hours ago was one of the fairest spots in Belgium. "These are my English children. Get them to their parents, Monsieur le Capitaine, and I shall be amply repaid." The officer shook his head. "Easier said than done, madame, but leave it, and I will see what can be done." "How is it you have been so indiscreet as to remain here? You ought to have removed yourself and them while there was still time." Mademoiselle shook her head. "We imagined we were of no account, and we have had no news for several days. We were assured that the tide of battle had flowed in a different direction. It is everywhere, mademoiselle, an evil flood rolling over the whole of our country. But look you, I will see what can be done." He was as good as his word, and that evening after dark, in an armored motor car, Julie Ledru and her charges were driven for hours and miles by tortuous ways which kept them out of danger until they reached Ghent, where it was still possible to get a train for Ostend. 2 days later she landed in England with Rose and Biddy, herself utterly ruined, her home gone, one of the most pitiful of the refugees. But she was warmly welcomed and gratefully by Biddy's father, and in a few days' time was safe in a warm, comfortable home on the Irish coast, where Rose, too, was made welcome, until her own relatives in India could be communicated with. It was an experience the two girls would never forget, one which will remain with them through life as a very poignant personal experience of the Great War. End of chapter 19. Recording by Gabriel Glenn.
Chapter 20 of Princess Mary's Gift Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pam Castile. Princess Mary's Gift Book, Chapter 20. Fleur-de-lis by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Fleur-de-lis had been christened Marie Hortense Amélie Dupont, Marie for her mother, Hortense and Amélie in honor of the two Vicomtesses de Rastignac, sole survivors of the proud old royalist family in whose service Marie's mother and grandmother had lived, and into whose service Marie herself had been born. But when La Petite Marie Hortense Amélie was a mere blossom of babyhood, she forsook the name that the priest had given her as he touched her downy head with the holy water, and chose instead to be called Fleur-de-lis, a name, in sooth, much better suited to a noble daughter of the Rastignacs than to a child of Marie Dupont, maker of tissue-paper flowers, and Pierre Dupont, street musician. Fleur-de-lis had first opened her eyes in a very humble chamber, but it was large enough to hold a deal of sweet content, which grew all the sweeter when she came to share it. There were only 2 rooms for father, mother, and child, and these were in a dreary tenement house, for Pierre Dupont, a stranger in a strange land, was having a desperate struggle with poverty. On being discharged from the hospital, where he had passed through the dangerous illness that left him a maimed and broken man, he had to begin the world all over again, and begin it single-handed, in very truth. There were few things to which he could turn his one hand. One of them was the crank of a street piano, and in a modest example of that modern instrument of torture he accordingly invested the last of his savings. He was much too good for it, but by regarding it distinctly as a hated object, which should be discarded the moment something better appeared, he mastered his aversion, and by wheeling it through the streets from morning till night, he managed to live, for there were always people who wanted to hear it, and others who did not, so that between the 2 classes he scraped together enough for his frugal needs. Marie was young and pretty and loyal, and when affairs were most desperate she offered to take the baby Fleur-de-lis and accompany her husband, gathering the pennies in a tambourine, while he ground so-called music from the piano with the left arm, that grew so weary in the monotonous service. But there was not a trace of the mountebank in Pierre Dupont, nor a drop of beggar's blood in his veins. He was poor and crippled, but he had still the self-respecting pride of the peasant whose people had served noble families, and who know what true nobility is. He could injure the dead and gone Rastignacs if he must, by trundling about a second-hand street piano, but he could at least spare them the insult of adding a monkey or a woman to the procession. So Maman Marie, loving him more than ever for his chivalrous regard of her, took up an almost forgotten pastime of her girlhood, and fell to making artificial flowers, which she sold to an old woman who stood on the street corners and offered them to the passers-by. The 2 rooms in the tenement house were as neat as care and thrift could make them. The windows opened only into the court, it is true, but Pierre and Marie did not need to look out of doors to get a pleasant view, for they could look at each other and at the baby. Besides, the glass was spotlessly clean and hung with equally spotless curtains. The floors were uncarpeted, but there was never a speck of dust on them. The little kitchen where Marie worked had a not unappetizing fragrance from the pot-au-feu that simmered on the stove. It had also a gleam of sunshine in it for a few hours each day. Sometimes when Pierre left his incubus for half an hour and ran home for a mouthful of bread and soup, he looked at Maman Marie sitting by her table in the sunshine, her scissors gleaming among the paper flower petals, and at Fleur-de-lis sitting at her feet, playing with the rainbow-colored scraps, and then he fell on his knees beside them, and putting his arm about them both, forgot that it was the only one he had, forgot that he was poor and crippled, and that the future was all uncertain, remembering only that he had home and wife and child, and that life with all its hardships was inexpressibly dear to him. For it happens sometimes that a poet's soul is lodged in a very humble tenement, and a love that would do honor to a knight blossoms and flourishes in the midst of mean and pitiful surroundings. Fleur-de-lis's cradle had curtains made of a bit of tricolour, and from the centre of the canopy there hung a medal of the Virgin, swinging on a narrow ribbon of blue. The cradle itself was a wooden box, and Marie, with a maternal ingenuity that surmounted the lack of ordinary materials, had lined the inside of the hood with tissue paper flowers, white and blue fleur-de-lis, to match those on the faded satin coverlet, a fragment of ancient grandeur where the Rastignac's coat of arms was intertwined with the Bourbon lilies of France. And when the baby's vagrant gaze wandered to the flowery heaven above her head, and her pink fingers reached to touch it and to stroke the soft counterpane, Maman Marie would tell her the name of the posies, and so after a time, when she discovered that people and things possessed names, Marie Hortense Amélie Mademoiselle Bébé elected to call herself Fleur-de-lis. It was the first word she lisped, and attached it to herself with the utmost complacency. It was appropriate enough, for she looked as if she might have been originally intended for a flower, and then somehow a soul had strayed into the flower, and it had fluttered down to earth as a child. A curious blossom to come from lowly stock, a kind of tender and beautiful miracle wrought out of common clay by the fashioning and refining power of love. At times when Marie sat at her work and looked at Fleur-de-lis cooing and smiling under her tricolored curtains, she forgot the strange land outside the windows, and the babble of strange tongues in the crowded tenement, and as her deft brown fingers shaped the tissue flowers, she saw in fancy the poppies and the wheat and the lilies of her native Breton fields. She saw the sun shining on the old chateau, her mother hanging a chaplet on the Baron's tomb in the little oratory, the aged Baroness walking sadly in the pleasaunce. All were gone. The chateau was dismantled. The proud old family, rooted for centuries to the soil of Brittany, had gradually lost its land and its riches, till now there was only one frail old dame, poor and childless, to maintain the ancient title. All these memories, half sad, half sweet, flitted in and out of Marie's mind, as she snipped and trimmed and twisted and shaped, her head on one side to view the result, like a little brown pheasant regarding a berry, and if Fleur-de-lis slept, she hummed a Breton lullaby as she twined her paper noosgays. What wonder, then, that there was a French air about them that attracted purchasers? So, hope clad in April green, made life worth living for father and mother. And as for Fleur-de-lis, she was a child, and she had love, and that was enough. and it is sad when we grow so old that it does not suffice for us. But these days, so full of care and anxiety, of weariness and self-denial tinged with happiness, came to an end. For when Fleur-de-lis was 2 years old, Maman Marie, young and strong, passionately in love with life, desperately needed by husband and child, had to leave them, to journey on alone to another far country, having just grown wonted to this. Then the light went out of the two little rooms that had been home. Indeed, it seemed to go out of the world altogether. Hard times, and yet harder ones, descended upon poor Pierre Dupont. Marie's earnings no longer helped to swell the slender income, and there were no willing women's hands to cut and plan and save, to contrive and embellish. Added to this, the piano suddenly grew uncertain, and subject to grave musical lapses, attacks of aphasia in the middle of some tunes, and of asthma in the middle of others, so that the hoot of the stony-hearted bystander and the ruffianly small boy became familiar to Pierre's ears, for he could not afford to buy new cylinders to fit into the old instrument, and to keep it up to the demands of the street, which is always delighted if you cannot sing the old songs, and wishes the latest melody to the exclusion of everything else. Fleur-de-lis had been left in the care of a woman for many weeks after Marie's death, but the sight of her tear-stained face at night, the tender frenzy with which she lifted her arms to her father when he came in, the sob of joy with which she buried her head in his coat, the sigh of content with which she stroked his cheek between every mouthful of bread and milk as she sat on his knee eating her meagre supper, all this was too much for his loving heart. He had a small sum of money that he had been hoarding to attach Annie Rooney and comrades to his unfashionable instrument, that he might appease the public by the gratification of its darling wishes, and withdraw the Boulanger march from its sated ears. This money he took and went to a carpenter's shop in the neighbourhood. After many explanations in his broken English, and many diagrams rudely drawn on paper, the carpenter succeeded in building a primitive sort of baby carriage on one end of the street piano. It had two wheels of its own, and moved somewhat in harmony with the ancient instrument, which had its difficulties of locomotion nowadays, as well as its musical weaknesses. It had a drawer in which Fleur-de-lis's playthings were kept, a battered doll, and boxes of her favourite scraps of bright tissue paper, the top of an old cotton umbrella, and a square of rubber cloth, like that which covered the piano when it rained. Here Fleur-de-lis sat for many hours each day, happy and content. Pierre would often take her out and let her toddle by his side until she was tired, when she would ascend her throne again. She wore a faded corduroy jacket and an old woolen cap, but the flower face that smiled above the one, and the shower of chestnut hair that fell from beneath the other, made you forget the poverty of her raiment. She was always clean and sweet and comfortable, for Pierre, with the gentleness and patience of a woman, washed and even mended, in a rough sort of way, that the child might not wholly miss a mother's care. Matters were going on in this way, rather from bad to worse, when one November day father and child turned off a side street and trundled into one of the fashionable avenues of the city. Pierre did not often wheel his piano in front of brownstone houses. It was too old and wheezy to commend itself to localities accustomed to Seidel's orchestra and the Hungarian band, but he scarcely knew today whither his aimless feet were carrying him. For 2 weeks he had gone out in the early morning and evening, leaving Fleur-de-lis asleep, and had spent an hour or two in a vain quest for employment. But his speech was broken, and he had only one arm. Small wonder that he failed when hundreds of men with 2 arms and nimbler tongues were seeking the same thing and failing. People generally told him that he ought to have stayed at home in his own country, where he belonged, but that, as he had not done that, his next best plan was to get back there at the earliest possible moment. If they had had time to hear his justification, for cumbering the earth of this free country, he might have told them that he left France a strong young man, with a strong young wife, and nearly 1,500 francs for the inevitable rainy day, but that the rainy day had turned out to be a continual downpour. He was wondering, in a dull, vague sort of way, as they rattled along over the cobblestones, why there was not bread for the mouths that needed it. He wondered why, through no fault of his own, he should have been maimed and crippled, why the loss of wife should have followed the loss of limb, why there was not enough work in the world for the people who were willing to do it, why the children in the luxurious carriages that swept past him should be swathed in furs while Fleur-de-Lis's hands were blue in her ragged mittens. The universe was a mystery to Pierre Dupont. Search it as he might, he could find no key to its curious distribution of miseries and injustices. It seemed to him that, if some people would be content to take a little less, there might be a little more for him. But he was by no means certain of the soundness of this comfortable theory. A little less gold plate on that harness, for instance, a yard less of lace on the gown of that lady just stepping into her brougham, a single diamond from her marquise ring. No, that superficial and snarling philosophy did not help Pierre. There was neither envy nor rage in his heart as yet, only a dull despair, a groping in the dark for a reason. Many of these fortunate people, he supposed, deserved their fortunes and had earned them. They were cleverer than he, and had friends and opportunities not vouchsafed perhaps to him. But why, since he was not clever, and since he had neither friends nor opportunities, should he have been deprived first of his principal means of self-support, and then of his consolation, his courage, his other and braver self? And now it was the anniversary of Marie's death. That made the day even harder to bear, for in some subtle way the remembrance of certain hours or moments in a dear dead past is always more bitter when we say to ourselves with a sigh, "It was just a year ago." Nature was in no buoyant mood. A cold, drizzling rain, which ought to have been snow, fell from time to time. The chill dampness made people draw their wraps closer and look drearily at the sky. Even the children appeared less joyous than usual. Men turned up the bottoms of their trousers and the collars of their coats, and hurried past one another with a gruff nod that would have been a smile on a sunny day. The bare branches of the trees shivered in the wind, and a few snowbirds huddled themselves together cheerlessly here and there, as if even they wished themselves farther south. Pierre took out the rubber cloth to cover his piano, and as he did so he saw two children at the second story of a fine house near by. He expected to be ordered away by a butler in livery at the moment he disclosed the limitations of his musical instrument, but one could never tell. The butler might be wooing the parlour maid. So he drew up in front of the driveway. Fleur-de-Lis had just walked several blocks, and, on being lifted into her carriage, hoisted the dilapidated cotton umbrella and wrapped her doll in an extra bit of calico. Pierre turned the crank. The piano began on "Love's Young Dream." It seemed to him that, with every revolution of the handle, he twisted the chords of his aching heart, and that presently it would break, as the battered old cylinders threatened to do, and for the same reason, because, alas, too many tunes had been played upon them. When ill fortune descends too thick and fast upon the human spirit, unless it can draw fresh accessions of strength from within, from without, from above, it sinks inevitably into despair. Man may be conscious that he is made in the image of God, fitted to endure, to conquer all things, but for the time he is common human clay. He faints and dies, or falls into a cowardly lethargy that is worse than death. Such a moment had come to Pierre Dupont. In his first crushing blow he had had a wife to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. He had now his passionate devotion to his child, but in cold and weariness, in hunger and friendlessness, ill fortune and despair, would love be able to keep itself pure, noble, self-denying, hopeful? There were ways of forgetting, of dulling one's self, of blotting out memory for hours together. His wants were comparatively simple, but since he could not realize them, why not give up the struggle? He did not wish for a carriage or a palace. He wished to give up his vagrant life for some labor by which he could maintain himself and give his child a start towards honest womanhood. That was not extravagant, surely, and if God were indeed in his heaven, and all were indeed right with the world, it seemed to Pierre that it was none too much to ask. He finished Love's Young Dream and began the Boulanger March. A young girl of 18 or 19, with an open book in her hand, joined the children at the window. She had a beautiful, rather serious face, and it brightened into amusement and then into earnestness as she caught sight of the quaint vehicle, of the child under the faded umbrella, and of the empty sleeve of the musician. Pierre ground on mechanically. It was "I dreamt that I dwelt in marble halls" now, and he hoped that a dime would be flung from the window before he came to within a mile of Edinburgh town, for that was the weakest part of his repertoire. The group still stayed at the window, and the crisis could not be delayed. The piano jerked through several bars, stopped and repeated, wheezed, and returned to the Boulanger March, then bounded again to Edinburgh town, and after several ineffectual attempts to finish it, made an asthmatic dash into No One to Love. Pierre looked anxiously under the porte-cochere for the resentful butler, but the children shrieked with renewed delight, and the young girl, going away from the window, presently appeared, running down the driveway and slipping on her jacket as she came. She approached the edge of the sidewalk, for there was no group about the piano, and after a brief interview with Pierre, she left a piece of silver with him and went upstairs to her mother. Janet Gordon was a great anxiety to her family. She was possessed of the most extraordinary ideas, and no one could tell whence they came, unless she became infected by them in some mysterious fashion, as one is by microbes. At all events, she had never inherited them in the legitimate way. At present, it is true, she had not been introduced to society, but unless a great change of heart should make itself apparent in a few months, she threatened to be no ornament to her set, and no source of pride to an ambitious mother. "Please look out of the window, mamma," she said, bringing a breath of raw air into her mother's flower-scented sitting-room. Mrs. Gordon rose languidly, her tea-gown trailing behind her. "What is it? Anything more than an organ-grinder who has been rasping my nerves for 5 minutes? Oh, I see what you mean. What an extraordinary combination! A child in one end of the machine. Tell Heloise to give the man a dime, dear." "I have given him a quarter myself, and have had a little talk with him. He is quite different from the ordinary organ grinder, mamma." "Oh, of course," said Mrs. Gordon good-naturedly. "All your geese are swans, dear. A dime was quite enough for him." "But he has only one arm, you see, mamma." "Of course. They never have. That is one of the tricks of the trade. They bind one arm down to the side, and then slip the coat over it. If you notice the man tomorrow, he will have the left sleeve hanging empty, and be playing with the right arm. It is more effective." "I'm sure there is no deception in this case, mamma." "Well, have it your own way, child, but pray don't take off his coat to investigate, or you'll be catching some dreadful disease. It does seem strange that poor people should always be so odiously dirty when water costs nothing." "This man is as clean as possible, and so is the baby. Her name is Fleur de Lis. Is it not quaint?" "Just what I should expect. The dirtier and commoner they are, the more regal and fanciful are the names they give their children. I suppose your Fleur de Lis is redolent of garlic, like the pansies and violets of her class." "No, she is not. She is as sweet as a rose, but her face is almost blue with cold." "Of course. What can the man expect if he trundles her about in this weather? But I suppose he does it to enlist public sympathy. I wonder why foreigners choose this particularly obnoxious way of getting a living, and if they must do it, why they go about with a decrepit old instrument like that. Yes, his piano is very old, but he cannot afford to rent a better one just at present. He said in his broken English, I had not the Marche Boulanger, neither Comrades, mademoiselle. It was then I had what you call bad luck, and now, mon Dieu, it is that I have not tararaboom-die. And as for the child, he does not allow her to take the money. I was dropping the quarter into her hand when he touched his cap and said, Pardon, give it to me, mademoiselle, s'il vous plaît. You see, if the monies keep putting in her hand, she will grow up one little beggar. She does not make the music, she does not push the piano, bien, she shall not take the monies. Extraordinary, murmured Mrs. Gordon satirically, as she fitted the cushions to her back more luxuriously. You must repeat that speech to your father. I actually believe that a new order of philosophic mendicant is springing up to match the new charity. The new charity does not wish to pauperize poverty, and the new poverty does not wish to be pauperized. It is really very amusing. He is forced to take the child with him because she has no mother, explained Janet. Of course she has no mother. They make it a point to have no mother, or if they have, they say they never knew who she was, nor where she is. They know where this mother is, said Janet gravely, for she died a year ago today. Really, Janet, you exasperate me beyond measure, talking with these low people and allowing them to fill your mind with their falsehoods. What is it you wish to do? You have given the man a quarter already. That will quench his thirst for the present. Heloise, don't take Fifine out without her blanket. She has been shivering on the rug before the fire. Go back to your books, Janet. There will always be poor organ grinders, and most of them will have lost some of their arms or legs, and all of them will have motherless or worse than motherless children. It's the way of the world, and if you had the wealth of the Indies, you could never set things right. And, Heloise, come back a moment. Tell Madame Labiche that all 3 gowns must be sent home tomorrow, and that I shall give her no more orders if she copies any detail of my costumes for her other customers. And don't forget the American Beauties, 2 dozen, the longest stems, and give that piano child at the gate 10 cents more as you pass. I know it is not right, Janet, but you are so insistent. The societies tell you never to bestow alms without first looking into the case and finding whether it is really deserving. But I am too weakly benevolent, and too lazy besides, ever to restrain. Janet, are you mad? Close that window at once. And Mrs. Gordon almost shrieked as she held down her frizzes with both hands to shield them from the raw wind that rushed in from outside. She would not have spoken so peremptorily had it not been for the effect of the damp air on her coiffure. When her front hair was crimped and protected from the assaults of the atmosphere, she was an amiable woman and could discuss any subject with calmness, but deprive her of 20 little gold wire hairpins daintily darned into her auburn frizzes, and the invisible hairnet that Heloise pinned on with such nicety, and she would not have listened to any argument in the world, even if it concerned the salvation of her own soul. "I was only going to speak a word to the man, mamma," said Janet apologetically. "I believe you've been reading Tolstoy," returned her mother, going to a mirror to repair damages. "Heavens, what a fright you've made me! I wish those Russians would keep their universal brotherhood ideas and their cholera germs at home. Dear mamma, I scarcely know who Tolstoy is, except that he wrote a novel about Anna somebody that you will not let me read. I do not know what Tolstoy thinks about the wrong in the world, or how he means to right it. I am not as sentimental as you and papa seem to fancy. I am not certain that I ought to wrap that cold little child in my new sealed jacket and run bareheaded by the side of the organ collecting pennies for the poor one-armed man. I know that if I should go down into the slums I should find 1,000 others, and that if I worked from year's end to year's end and spent papa's entire fortune, I could not make them all comfortable. But don't you believe, mamma, when once in a while need, poverty, and sorrow seem to come directly in contact with plenty and riches and happiness, that it means something, and that we ought to stop and think out something special? Oh, I'm sure I don't know, child. You confuse me so with your persistence, and I can't think of anything while he sticks fast in the middle of Edinburgh town. Give him $50 if you like, anything to get rid of him, though he succeeds wonderfully in amusing the children. I don't want to give him any more money, mamma, said Janet with a sigh. I only feel as if I must not lose sight of the child. There, they are going. Pierre covered his piano, pinned the rubber cloth more tightly round Fleur-de-Lis's throat, and was preparing to move off in the direction of home, when Janet darted into the nursery, and flinging open the window in front of the children, called impetuously in her clear young voice, "Bonsoir, Fleur-de-Lis. Bonsoir, monsieur. Revenez bientôt, je vous prie." Pierre's face lighted with surprise and pleasure, and as he took off his cap he stammered excitedly, "De bonsoir, bébé. Je vous remercie mille fois, mademoiselle. Je reviendrai." He wheeled his piano to the shed where he kept it under cover at night, and carried Fleur-de-Lis home on his arm. After he had undressed her and laid her in her crib, he took a crucifix from a drawer where, in a moment of bitterness, he had hidden it the day before, and kissing it, restored it to its accustomed place above the head of his bed. And the anniversary of Marie's death did not go out in utter blackness after all, nor was it entirely because of the 2 pieces of silver that had unexpectedly swelled the day's receipts. He had felt the magic of a friendly voice. The beautiful little lady had spoken to him in his native tongue. She had drawn a fragment of his story from him, and thus relieved the weight of his heart. She had smiled on the child and kissed her. She had asked him to come again, and as he fell asleep he whispered, "Merci mille fois, mademoiselle. Je reviendrai." End of chapter 20. Recording by Pam Castile. End of Princess Mary's Gift Book by Various.